Hey guys, and welcome to this edition of Scrub's Garage. Excited to have you with me today. Excited to bring you a project I've been wanting to do actually since I did my first track day with my Corvette, which is an engine oil cooler. This block adapter from Improved Racing has a thermostat built into it. So this is probably the heart of the system that I'm going to install. Like I said, this came from Improved Racing, part number EGM-122. So this is the 180-degree thermostat, and it's the block adapter as well. So this will go, you have your oil filter down here, this bolts to the side of the block, your oil pressure sensor goes here, you'll reuse that from what's already on the car. But I went with the Setrab 625, so it's their 6 series oil cooler, and it's a 25 row. To feed the oil, obviously we're going from the block adapter to the cooler, so I'm running 10 AN braided stainless steel lines that go to and from the cooler. I have some Adele clamps to help secure things as we route it along the frame rail up to the front. I have my 90-degree AN fittings. These adapt from this. There'll also be some that adapt from this, and then we can do the 90-degree to route them like we need to. The other thing I decided to do, this is a silicone fire retardant sleeve hose. So this has temperature resistance properties, and obviously it will also help prevent any chafing. That's one of the issues with braided stainless steel lines, is that if they rub on each other or if they rub on something else, it's fairly abrasive, so you can end up rubbing through something. And when we're talking about oil lines, it's the one thing you just simply cannot have a failure with. It's too costly there. And obviously, so where this is at, I have long tube headers. There's a lot of heat in that area, so I'd want to protect the line from the headers as well. Any place that may come close to being in contact with the headers, obviously you want to try to keep it away, but some heat insulation would be a good idea as well. I could have done just a few feet of this and insulated it right where it gets, through the header section, but I went ahead and bought enough of this. I'm actually going to run this sleeving over the full length of my lines, to and from. It's really just a few extra bucks, and so I figured just for the extra insulating properties, it was worth another 20-25 bucks or whatever it ended up being. So at this point, for what I've got tied up in this, spending a few extra dollars not too big of a deal. So this is what I'm going to do. The other thing you'll have to figure out, obviously, that I don't have a bracket for how I want to mount this. So I've got an idea of the type of bracket I'm going to try to fabricate, find out if that works. Hey guys, alright, so I've pretty much got my mounting bracket like I want it. So I'll just kind of give you a rundown of the steps I took to make this. So this is made out of 16 gauge steel. I just went down to Lowe's. They sell this in a larger sheet. So I laid out what I wanted my dimensions to be for each of the bends, for each of the sides, and then I trimmed it to size. This is another Harbor Freight's finest, but this is a sheet metal shear, and it cut through this very nicely. So I'd highly recommend having something like this available for cutting down the steel to the size that you need. So this ended up being 6 3/4 by 13 inches wide. The 13 matches the width of the oil cooler. So this side is 1.5 inches. This will mount on a cross member. It's part of the crash bar that goes across the front of the car, which is a 1 inch by 1 inch square tube that goes across. So I have 3 mounting holes. It will sit on top of that cross member. Like I said, it's 1.5 inches, so it comes out. Then this dimension is 3 1/4, and then this dimension is 2 inches, and that's the thickness of the oil cooler. Then I have laid out my mounting holes for the oil cooler. It does have some tabs that protrude through here, and if you don't cut a slot or something, or accommodate for that thickness in some capacity, this won't sit flush down against this. So I use my Dremel with a little tiny cutoff wheel and slice down into this to make a couple of nice grooves. Go through with that a couple of times, and this sits on there very nicely. Then I'll use some grade 8
locking hardware to mount this to the bracket. I do suggest getting to know your sheet metal bender before you start making your final bracket. So I just took a piece of the scrap when I initially trimmed this to size and just practice making a couple of bends. You just want to understand what your radius is going to be. So, you know, when you lay out your measuring marks, you know, if this needs to be 2 inches, where exactly is that bend going to happen? So just make sure you understand your bender and how this pivots before you go making your official bracket. Otherwise you may waste some sheet metal and have to start over. The other tricky thing, so this is a sheet metal brake, again from Harbor Freight, some of their finest equipment. In stock form, unmodified, it bends to about a 90-degree bend, maybe just slightly more, but not much more than 90 degrees. But obviously, this angle is much more than 90 degrees. 90 degrees would have come, you know, straight across. We needed more than that, so this lays back. When this is mounted on it, it will lay back at the same angle as the AC condenser and the radiator. Otherwise, if it sticks up more vertical, you'll hit the shroud, the plastic shroud there. So to get more angle out of this, you have to grind down on the stops. So here's kind of a close-up of how I modified the stops in my sheet metal brake. I used a angle grinder, a cutoff wheel, to grind down into this. So as this comes up, normally, if I can get this at an angle, it would stop about there. It's where it would normally stop. I kept grinding so that this would come significantly further. You have to do the same thing on this side as well, though not quite as significantly. The angle on this piece is a little differently, so you don't have to grind this quite as much. But if you, like I said, grind this out, you can get a fair amount more angle out of the brake. If you're curious what angle the bracket angles down, so that this lays back with the AC condenser and the radiator, from the horizontal, it's leaning down at about 27, 28 degrees. I can get that so that you can see it. So one of the things I did to start prepping for how I wanted to set things up, I had a piece of 5/8 just rubber hose, roughly 5.5 feet long, that I used to test fit, kind of test run how I wanted to route my AN line. So before I end up cutting this, I wanted to have at least a general idea of where I wanted to run it, how long each piece would need to be. So I bought 11 feet of the braided AN 10 AN line, but I don't want to cut it until I have at least a rough estimate of how long each piece needs to be. I bought 11 feet, and in my mind I thought I'd probably have a foot or two left over. Based on test running my line, I think it's actually going to be really close. I'm probably going to need every bit of this 11 feet. Obviously, when you mount the cooler in there, you have the two pieces that come off the top. So one line needs to be 6 or 8 inches longer than this line, which is good because I can, the way I think this is going to work out, I've laid it out. One piece will be about 63 inches. The other piece will be 69 inches. And I think that should work out so that I have enough to reach back there to the adapter block. But so I guess the takeaway here is just lay out your lines ahead of time so that you don't end up cutting your AN line and end up one piece being a little too short, or you need the other piece a little bit longer. Plan ahead. So I found another piece of rubber hose that you can practice your bends and get it where you need it to be. So we'll talk for a second about cutting braided stainless steel AN hose. Pretty straightforward, and you can find some other videos on YouTube if you want to look at them. I used black electrical tape to wrap the line. That way when we cut this, it doesn't end up fraying, and we get a nice clean line, and we hold the two ends together. If you end up with it fraying, you'll have a hard time getting it to fit inside the AN fitting. To do the cutting portion of it, again, Harbor Freight's finest. This is the Pittsburgh 28-inch cable cutters. I'm going to use these to cut the AN line. It'll be important that we get a good square cut and nice and clean. So I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So I'll get the hose squared up in the cutters. We'll make our cut. So I got my braided stainless steel line cut to the length that I want. I'm going to use this Race Flux insulating sheathing over the outside of my braided line. As I mentioned earlier in the setup for this video, I probably could have gotten away with just a couple of feet of this, just to run it particularly in the area where this line gets close to the headers. But for no more expensive than it is, I decided to get a 10-foot roll, and I'll cover almost all of the braided line from start to finish. It's extra $20 or something for the longer piece of sheathing, so I figured that might be worth it. It's easy to cut. I measured off 5 feet, and then I used electrical tape over the end of the braided hose just to make sure none of the stainless steel catches on the insulating sleeve here in the inside. So see how well this goes. And the key is just going to be getting it started without. There we go. Okay, see if I can demonstrate for you how these AN fittings fit onto the braided stainless steel AN line. So the AN fittings are a two-part fitting. You have this sleeve that will fit down over the end of the hose. You put this piece on first, then this section will fit down into this. So this tapered section here will actually fit down into the hose, and then there's a threaded section that will thread into the threads here at the top. So make sure you don't have any crazy pieces of the braided line sticking out here, because you want to slide this down over it. So as you go on, you kind of twist it just a bit. Pull this down so I can grip on it. And then you'll see the further down you go, eventually this will bottom out on the inside. It does take a little bit of effort. That's pretty good. So it bottoms out in there. I'm sure you can't actually see that. Another good tip, so as you're threading this down in there, we want to make sure that our end sleeve isn't backing off the hose. So make sure it's nice and square on there. Then take a magic marker and just mark the line. So as we run this piece in, you begin seeing this line coming down, you know we're actually backing the sleeve off the braided line instead of running it in. So it takes just a little effort, kind of get it centered in there. There we go, and you'll feel it pop into the center of the rubber part of this braided line. Then it's just a matter of screwing it in. Initially you'll be able to thread this in by hand, and then you'll get to a point where it really starts to tighten on the braided line, at which point you'll need to use some tools. There's a couple of companies that sell some pretty neat products, one of which is an aluminum insert that goes into your vise that will hold this end of the fitting so that you don't mar up your nice pretty AN fitting. In my case, you'll never see these. They're deep under the car, but if you're working on fuel lines or something on the top side of the engine where people would be able to see the quality of your work, you'd want to protect this surface. So like I said, for a few bucks you can get those. They fit down into your vise and hold this, and it makes it a little bit easier to tighten this section. You'll feel as you tighten this down, it will get fairly snug, but then you'll eventually feel it finally bottom out, and then just make it snug. You don't have to put a bunch of torque or foot-pounds on this, but you do want it just nice and snug, and that'll give you a nice leak-free seal. Okay, under the car now, we're ready to take off the engine oil temperature adapter block. So the factory one is held on by two 10mm bolts. It's hard to get my hand here so you can see it, but there's one here and one here. Normally your oil filter would be mounted here, so I drained the oil, I took the oil filter off, cleaned this area off. That'll give me just a little bit more room to work. I have long tube headers, so it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get to these two. But we'll take this off. There'll be a, a gasket that'll come off as well. The new adapter block has two O-ring ports to seal it back to the engine block. But there's also the oil temperature sensor that plugs into the top. Follow that wire back and disconnect the sensor. Then we'll replace that sensor into the new adapter block that we're going to put back on. Okay, so at this point I got the this is the factory little adapter that the oil temperature sensor goes into. So I took the factory sensor out. I've transferred it over to the Improved Racing adapter block. It goes into this fitting here. It does use a crush washer, so just make sure that gets snug, but you don't have to do a ton of torque on that. These two fittings go in. These are O-ring type adapter fittings, so get them snug, but again you don't have to use a ton of torque on these either. And then of course the two 90-degree fittings will fit onto this. Okay, so just a quick update. So I tried to connect my AN lines to the adapter block by pulling the lines down under the car. However, there just wasn't enough room with my long tube headers to get the lines with the adapter block attached back up into position for where the adapter block needs to bolt to the side of the oil pan. So I ended up bringing my lines. You can kind of see down in there, you can see where it says Race Flux. Those are my lines. I pulled the two lines up in here, I attached my adapter block, and then I pulled it back in and then ran the lines into place, and I was able to get to it there. This is by no means an easy feat whatsoever. I spent quite a lot of time fighting, getting the adapter block into place. It's a snug fit, and those lines and everything that's in there and the long tube headers make everything a chore, very difficult to get to. The next challenge, the factory block had two hex head bolts. You could put a wrench on those. The new adapter block uses an Allen head, well, an Allen drive type bolt, two bolts to go in and hold the new adapter block onto the side of the oil pan. So it makes it much more difficult to get in there with an Allen wrench or something to drive those bolts in. So I highly recommend. I went to Home Depot and got this extension, and it's angled a bit. If you can see that, this is a 5mm drive hex head, but it's kind of rounded at the top, so it doesn't have to just go straight in. You could be at a little bit of an angle, and with my long tube headers, I needed this extension to be able to run in there and tighten those bolts. So I highly recommend this. It came as a little kit. It was like 20 bucks. That might make your life a lot easier. I fought with it for quite a while before I finally gave up and ran to Home Depot and bought a tool. So hopefully that tip helps. One other tip while it's on my mind, obviously getting the adapter block mounted onto the side of the engine is a tight fit, and it's very important that the two O-rings don't fall out of the adapter block. That's what seals the adapter block to the engine. So to help hold those in, typically you put a little bit of motor oil on them, but to hold them a little bit better, if you use a little bit of Vaseline, it's a little thicker and a little bit stickier, and that'll help hold those O-rings into the two grooves that they fit into So as you're fitting that thing into place and you're kind of working it side to side to get the bolt started, that'll keep those from falling out, because if they fall out, you're going to have a massive oil leak. Okay, so just to give you an idea of where I'm at this point. So I've got the adapter block is mounted to the engine. I've got the AN lines connected to the adapter block. Everything's run here to the front. I've loosely connected the AN lines to the oil cooler. I want to make sure I don't have too much slack in the AN lines hanging down under the car. So before I drill my final mounting holes in the cross member for mounting my oil cooler bracket, I test fit everything and decided how far towards the driver or passenger side I wanted the oil cooler. So at the moment it's probably skewed just a little bit towards the passenger side, and I did that just so I could take up just a little bit of the slack in the lines, so I don't have anything hanging down under the car. The other thing I did to help me make sure I get the holes aligned correctly for when I drill into the cross member to mount the oil cooler bracket, I made a little template just out of cardboard, and I laid that across the oil cooler bracket and where I had the holes drilled in that, and I marked those holes here, and then I took like a sharp pick and I marked the center point in each of those holes. So I'll be able to lay this along the cross member under the car. I'll kind of take that into place, and then I'll use a center punch, like a spring-loaded center punch. If you don't have one of these, it's an excellent tool for help marking where you want to drill a hole, and it makes a little indent in the metal, and then you can drill a pallet hole. That will help keep your holes properly aligned. So just a little tip there. Okay, so I've got my holes mounted, drilled in the front cross member. I had to enlarge a couple of these just to get the alignment like I wanted it, but this part is finished, so this is ready to bolt up. However, this lays back against the AC condenser. It's very close, and obviously if we're only mounting it at the bottom, there could be some vibration in that, and I don't want this banging against the AC condenser for the long term. So what I'm going to do, I've got some of this really thin weather stripping. I'm going to run a couple pieces down each side and maybe across some of these sections as well, just so there's a little bit of cushion in there. Like I said, this is going to be laid up pretty tight against it, so I think they'll stay in place. The other thing I'm going to do to help hold the top secure, I have some of these. It's like a zip tie, except it's for mounting like a power steering cooler or any type of cooler. So these are designed to press in between the fins here, and this is obviously long enough it will go through the oil cooler, the AC condenser, and the radiator as well, and it has a little cushion that you can put in there. So it would go this way through the oil cooler. I'll put the cushion in there, and then it'll go through, like I said, the AC condenser and the radiator, and then it has the locking piece on the other side, and then you can just trim it to the length that you need. So that's how I'll keep a little bit of tension on the top section of the oil cooler, just so it doesn't vibrate, and then like I said, I have some cushion in there as well. So I'll get those pieces lined up, and then I'm going to pre-fill the oil cooler. So I've taped off the port so that I don't get any trash in there. I'll take my tape off, and like I said, I'll pre-fill this with oil so that on the first startup, oil will get to the motor just a little bit quicker.
Okay, under the car, it's probably not the best angle. It's hard to get a good shot of all of this, but I guess my one complaint is the angle that they put the oil temperature sensor at in the adapter block. As you can see, the wires are pulled pretty tight. It's not horrible, and I think they'll be okay, but they're more tight than I'd be comfortable with, to be honest. And if they just changed the angle that that sensor was at, it would free up even just 1/4 of an inch of slack in the connector would be sufficient. Because before, that sensor was at the top, so it wasn't pulled so tight. I even rearranged how some of the lines were run just to get a little better angle. But I think that's about as good as it's going to get. Okay, one of our final steps, we want to turn the motor over
with the fuel pump relay removed, the fuel pump fuse, excuse me. So the car doesn't start, but we do want to turn over the motor so that we can build oil pressure before the motor fires up. So we're going to pull fuse number 13 out of the engine block, engine bay fuse box. So number 13 is this 20 amp fuse right here. Just grab some needle nose pliers and you can pull that fuse out. We'll set it to the side. Like I said, we'll turn the car over 10-15 seconds, maybe just whatever it takes to build oil pressure. We'll check for leaks, and then we'll start the car. The normal Corvette oil fill capacity is 6.5 quarts. Of course, I pre-filled the oil cooler before I mounted it. It held roughly half a quart plus the 10 AN lines running to and from the engine block will hold a little additional, though probably not a significant amount. So I've started with 7 quarts, the 6.5 for the normal fill, plus the extra half quart to fill the oil cooler. So I'm at 7 quarts at the moment. After I've started and run the car, I'll check the level on the dipstick, and then I typically run an extra quart for when I'm going to be on the track. So I may be up to 8 quarts. I'll probably go 7.5, check it again, see where that puts me. And if I feel like it can hold a little bit more, I may do the 8 quarts. And then okay, so I started the car up the first time. I only let it run maybe 30 to 60 seconds, and then I shut it off to check for leaks. It turns out I did have a small leak. The 2 AN lines that come off of the top of the adapter block, one of them had gotten loosened just a little bit while I was fishing it into place. That's one of the drawbacks to connecting the lines to the adapter block before it's mounted to the engine. It's very susceptible. You've got a lot of leverage on those lines. It can end up moving one of the lines just a little bit, and it loosens the fitting. Fortunately, I was able to get in there. This is it's an 8-inch adjustable wrench, a little bit shorter than some of the others, and I was able to come down on it at just enough of an angle that I could get it to tighten. I started the car again, ran another 60 seconds. Seems to be without any leaks at the moment. So at this point, I'll run the car long enough, let it get up to operating temperature. That way I know that the thermostat is open and it's moving a higher volume of oil into the oil cooler. Remember, when that thermostat is closed, it's only moving about 10% of the motor oil through the cooler itself. So when it's cold, there's not much oil actually flowing through the cooler. So anyway, I'll get it up to temperature. I'll probably go for a quick test drive just to get it to operating temperature. Then I'll come back. I'll check it again very thoroughly for leaks. Hey guys, just want to do a final follow-up. I just got back from my track day literally 30 minutes ago. I just unloaded the car. So I wanted to give you just a final update. So it's September at VIR. Temperatures were like 95 degrees. Out there on the black asphalt was probably even higher, probably closer to 100. Oil temps, even no matter how hard I ran it, I think the highest I saw today was 252 degrees out of the oil temp. So without a doubt, hands down, that oil cooler made a huge difference. Very happy with that. Water temps, 225 to 230. So that's kind of the upper threshold for that. I have to keep an eye on that. But again, I don't foresee running in temperatures hotter than this. Really anything hotter than this, and I'm just not going to drive. It's just too miserable for the driver. But overall, I'd say the engine oil cooler mod, 2 thumbs up, big success. So if you're thinking about it, jump in. You've seen the solution that worked for me. I hope it works for you too. See you soon.